Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the top end on your 2019 and newer KX450. This bike's a 2019 KX450 and it's time for us to replace the piston on it. Now Kawasaki recommends doing this every 6 races or 15 hours of run time, and the best way to track that interval is with an hour meter. Now I realize a lot of people actually run these pistons a little bit longer than the recommended service interval, but if you are going to do that, make sure you're replacing the piston at least every season. Now we're a little bit over the service interval on this bike, so it's time for us to get that piston replaced. And while we're in there, we're actually going to be looking at some of the valve train components and the valves to make sure nothing's worn out. So let's go ahead, we're going to jump into this. The process will be similar for 2019 and newer KX450s. Just make sure you refer to your model specific service manual for more information and specs. To do this job, we need some common hand tools, torque wrenches, we've got our digital calipers and feeler gauges. You will need a piston pin puller. We also have our micrometer and snap gauge, valve spring compressor, and then depending whether or not you're going to hone your cylinder, you may need a cylinder hone, the nylon brush to clean it out, and then we also have brushes to help clean our cylinder head up. You're going to need a drain pan, funnel, rags, safety glasses, and rubber gloves. Of course, we're going to need some fresh oil. We have our Tusk oil filter. You also need some coolant, some contact cleaner. We also have multi-purpose penetrating lube and assembly lube. And then for parts, we're going to use our Pro X piston. We also have gaskets and some valve keepers, valve stem seals, and exhaust gasket. We found all of these under the OEM diagram on our website. We're also using new spark plug, and depending on what measurements you take for your valve clearance, you may or may not need some shims. Now again, all this stuff can be found on our website, so be sure to check it out. First, we're going to start out having our bike clean. We don't want to get any dirt or anything into our top end components or the bottom end. So once you've done that, we're going to drain the oil, we'll drain the coolant, we'll remove our seat, disconnect the battery, and then we'll remove the gas tank. All right, now that we're to this point, I'm going to remove the exhaust. I'm going to pull these radiator braces. I actually don't have to pull these off, but just to better show the process, I'll remove that and a couple of other accessories. And then we're going to swing this subframe up and get our throttle body ready for removal. Now, I want to point out I just removed the subframe, and that way you guys can have a better view of everything, but you don't need to do that. So the next step, once you have your subframe swung up, is to remove the throttle body. And to do that, you're going to disconnect the fuel injector. You've got your intake air pressure sensor, disconnect that, and your throttle body connection for your throttle position sensor. And then you also want to get this regulator rectifier out of the way. So you have a connection, disconnect that, and then 2 bolts on the right side of the frame. Now we're going to loosen the hose clamp and remove the throttle body. And just to get this out of the way, I'm going to take it up to the handlebar and zip tie it out of the way. Now that we have the throttle body out of the way, we're going to clean up around this valve cover. And that way we don't get any dirt falling onto our engine parts. And then after that, we'll remove the retainer for our spark plug cap. We'll remove our spark plug cap and spark plug. Next thing we'll do is remove the valve cover. And at this point, we'll also disconnect the coolant temperature sensor and the radiator hose going down to the cylinder head. At this point, we need to put the engine at top dead center on the compression stroke. And how we'll do that is line up the mark on the flywheel cover, and then we also have some timing marks on our cam sprockets. Once all that's lined up, then we can check the valve clearance. As you turn the motor over, only turn it counterclockwise, and then these dots on the cam sprockets are going to line up with the mating surface of the cam cap. And to make sure that we have everything timed correctly and on the compression stroke, you want to make sure both cam lobes are facing out and away from each other. Next, we'll check our valve clearance and write it down. That way, if we need any different shims when we reassemble, we'll already have that measurement taken. The next step for us is to remove our engine hangers. That's going to give us better access to our cam chain tensioner. So this cam chain's a little bit different than some of the tensioners out there. We're going to remove this back bolt completely. There's going to be a spring in it. Then after that, we'll go ahead and remove the tensioner. And we'll also remove that gasket. So when I remove the camshaft cap, I'm going to count backwards. We've got these numbers on here. And I'm just going to turn each one about 1/4 of a turn, loosen them all up, and then we'll remove them all. And when you pull this off, you have a couple of keepers. They're just some half circles. Make sure you don't drop them into the bottom end. Just be really careful when you're pulling this up. So with the cam chain, I'm going to use some safety wire to hold this up. We'll take everything apart. And I'm just going to run it up to the handlebar. And I'm going to pull up on this intake cam. I'm going to remove that first, free it from the chain. And this is the half circle piece that I was talking about. Make sure you don't lose it or drop it. Next, we can remove the exhaust cam. And same thing with the clip. You also want to locate these dowel pins. Make sure you don't drop or lose those either. And then we also have an O-ring that we'll be removing. Next, we'll rotate these rocker arms backwards. I'm going to use a magnet to pull these shims out of place. Keep these in order. That way you can get the correct shims back when you're reassembling. At this point, we need to get the cylinder head ready to remove from the bike. So we're going to remove the 2 wires that are on the left-hand side. And right here we have another electrical connector going to a relay. We're going to get that out of our way as well. Now on the left side of the bike, we have an Allen head bolt. I'm going to remove that first. And there's one more Allen head bolt right down in here next to where that cam chain goes. And then we're going to remove the cylinder head bolts. And again with these, we're just going to break them loose about 1/4 turn at a time and back them all the way out in a crisscross pattern. Now at this point, we can use a soft face mallet and break the head free. So now that that's freed up, I'm going to loosen up this wire holding the cam chain. I'm going to let that drop down for now, and we'll pull the cylinder head out. And be careful with the surface where the camshafts ride. You don't want to damage that on the frame while you're taking this out. All right, next step is remove the cylinder head gasket. Then I'm going to remove the chain guide or chain slider. Once you've done that, you can locate these 2 dowel pins and pull them out. And then you can remove the cylinder. And it looks like we had a dowel pin fall out on the bottom. So you want to keep track of those as well. And when you're pulling this out, I like to keep one hand on the connecting rod, and that way it doesn't slap against the crankcase. And then that other dowel pin for us, it just stayed in the cylinder. Same with the gasket, it just pulled that whole thing up with it. So next thing we need to do is shove a rag down around the bottom end. And all we're trying to do here is when we remove this circlip, we want to make sure it doesn't fall into the bottom end, just in case we lose track of it. And to pull that circlip, I'm just using some small needle nose pliers to do that. So now to remove the piston, we're going to use our piston pin puller from Motion Pro and actually pull that thing out. You might get lucky, you might be able to push that through, but ours sticks after it just barely moves. Now at this point, we can clean up our base gasket material. And to do that, I want to make sure nothing gets down into this motor. So I'm going to put some more rags in here. And then also, you've got an oil feed port right here. And make sure you don't get anything down in there either. So now that we have our sealing surface clean, we're ready to inspect this connecting rod. Now on the rod, you can't have any up or down play. So I just grab onto it, pull up and down. If you feel any play, then you know you need to go in there and rebuild this bottom end. You will have some side-to-side play, so you can see I can slide this back and forth just a little bit, and that side-to-side clearance will be a spec in your manual. You can stick a feeler gauge down in there to measure it to make sure it's okay. And then for the small end of the connecting rod, you want to make sure, look down inside the bore Make sure there's no pitting or galling or any kind of visible damage. If this has been overheated, you're going to see a blue surface. So you want to make sure it's just nice and smooth in there. If you have any questions, you can get a small snap gauge and use a micrometer to take that measurement. So next, what we're going to do is clean the rest of our top end parts. So we need to scrape the gasket from the cylinder and our cylinder head. And with the cylinder head surface, you want to be careful with it and make sure you don't damage it. Now that we have our gasket surfaces cleaned up, I went ahead, I used some carbon clean. It's some fuel treatment. I let it soak in this combustion chamber and used a toothbrush to kind of scrub some of that carbon off, and it actually came off pretty easy on this one. Sometimes you won't have that much luck. It's going to be baked on there really good. So that is an option if that's what you want to do. So now to finish getting the cylinder ready, we need to inspect it for any deep scoring. And to get a better look at it, I'm actually going to spray it out with some contact cleaner. Wipe it out with a clean rag. And to inspect this, I'm going to take my glove off, and on the front and back of the cylinder where the piston rides, that's where most of the damage will occur if there is any. So what we're going to do is check for any scoring in here, and we run our finger across it. And if there's anything that catches your finger, then you want to pay really close attention to that, because you're probably going to have to get the Nicosil replated. Now on these cylinders, they're Nicosil plated, and Kawasaki recommends not honing these. So if you don't need to do anything with it, that's totally fine if you don't. But for us, we're going to deglaze our cylinder. So we're going to run a hone through there that's specifically made for Nicosil. But when you do this, you need to get in and get out and just be really careful, because it is possible to damage this Nicosil. If you have any more questions on that or the cylinder head, we're going to take it apart and inspect everything and just show you the basics and the most important things. But if you need to know more detailed information on the cylinder honing or the cylinder head, then we have videos for both of those, so be sure to check them out. Now that we have our cylinder honed, we need to clean everything up really good. We don't want any debris down in this cylinder that could possibly damage our new parts. So what I'm going to do is spray all the oil out with some contact cleaner. Then we're going to dip this in some warm soapy water and use a nylon brush to get any type of grit or any material out of the cylinder. We're also going to run a brush through that oil feed port as well. All right, once you get this cylinder washed up, you can rinse it out with some fresh water, and then I'm going to apply a light coating of oil to the cylinder. Now, as far as the piston and wrist pin go, we aren't going to be measuring this because, again, we're replacing it for preventative measures. And on the wrist pin, what you can actually do, if you pull this out, inspect it for any galling or pitting. Same thing on that small end of the connecting rod. If you notice any pitting on this, then you definitely probably have problems with the connecting rod as well. And the other thing that can happen, sometimes you'll see a lot of deep grooves in this piston skirt, and that's a good indicator that your cylinder is going to be really damaged as well. So ours is actually looking pretty good. Again, this is just preventative maintenance. The other thing you can look for, sometimes you get a lot of carbon on these piston rings and they kind of stick in place. So just some things to look out for. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our cylinder head. So with the cylinder head, we're going to remove our exhaust gasket. And then what we're going to do is a solvent test on this before we take it apart. And the reason for that, we want to make sure that our valves are sealing correctly. And if they're not, we need to find out what's going on in there. And it is possible you might have to take the cylinder head to a machine shop if something is damaged with the cylinder head, or you might have to replace it entirely. So to do that, we're going to fill the intake port. We'll fill it above to where the top of that valve face is and check for any leaks. So you just want to leave this solvent in here for about a minute. If there's any leaks, usually it's pretty obvious. And now we'll repeat those same steps for the exhaust side. Now with the cylinder head, it's really important to keep everything in order. That way we get everything back exactly where it goes. So on this, I've got some pins that are holding these rocker arms in place. They just slide out. And then what I like to do is put a punch in the vise and just be really careful you don't gouge the bottom of the cylinder head, and just where one of those studs go, just set it on there like that, and that way it's really easy to get all the valves out. So to get the valves out, I'm going to use the Tusk valve spring compressor. Now on this tool, I do want to point out the bottom of these valves have a little indent right there. So the tool, you can either use the rounded side on the bottom of the valve or this pointed side. So we're using the pointed side since that's just a small indent. And then we've just compressed the spring far enough to remove the keepers, and I'll use a magnet to pull them out. So now I'm going to back the tool off. I'll remove that spring along with the top spring retainer. So this one actually has 2 springs in it, and you'll notice that the tight coils are going closest to the cylinder head. So now I'm going to press this valve down about 1/8 of an inch or so, and I'm going to try to rock it back and forth just on the valve face. If these guides are worn out, you're going to feel a lot of play in there. If they're not, you're just going to barely feel that valve move. So these ones are feeling tight. And again, if you have a lot of play in there, you're going to want to watch our cylinder head rebuilding video. And the reason we're tearing the cylinder head apart is while we're in here replacing that piston, it's a good idea to make sure your valve seats and your valves are in good condition along with those valve guides. And we're going to be running new valve stem seals as well. So the next step is to remove that valve guide seal. To do that, you can use some pliers. I'm using some needle nose vice grips and just barely clamping on it just to make it a little easier. We'll pull those off. After that, we're going to remove the bottom spring seat. We'll repeat the same steps for the remaining 3 valves. We'll get everything cleaned up really well, and then we'll do a visual inspection for everything. And that concludes part 1 of our top end rebuild for the KX450. Now, if you need to know how to put this thing back together, follow us over to part 2. Like, subscribe, and check out our website for any parts that you might need.